suppose the first question is sort of what was your background? How did you end up with human rights work and being situated in Asia as well?
Sure. So I'm originally from Canada. I studied in Ottawa, Ontario. I studied international relations with a minor in comms, and I loved university. I had a really good experience, but I felt like it was just such an academic experience that I graduated sort of feeling like I didn't actually have a very strong grasp of what development looked like on the ground. So I left Canada to teach English, initially in Indonesia, and spent most of that year teaching and traveling a little bit and just trying to see more of the world that I had learned about through a textbook, but hadn't, been able to experience. And then at some point during that time, I ended up volunteering at a school for Karenni refugees along the Thai-Burma border. So they were refugees from Karenni state inside Burma who had fled the border and were studying in different schools. So the school that I was teaching at, we were teaching them community development and organization. And the idea was that they could take these kind of leadership skills and tools that they were learning and then go back to the refugee camps they were living in and facilitate projects and support their community with these tools and keep all of the development very locally led. Um, and that was kind of a turning point for me. I had never really gotten a close look at locally led development on the ground. I I really, was quite ignorant. I didn't know that much about Burma and the human rights situation. It was a country, that had been under serious lockdown of its own for a very long time without access to the internet or much of the outside world. So I was fascinated. And after spending about 6 months teaching there, I moved to Karenni State inside Burma to work with a local women's organization to try and get, I guess, even closer to some of the issues that my students had shared and taught me about. I was just very curious. So that was about 6 years ago. And since then, I've moved between Burma and working on the border in Thailand with different locally led organizations.
That's so cool. I suppose like getting the first-hand experience is so much more valuable than reading about principles in a book or something like that.
Exactly. Like it kind of blew my mind. And also, I mean, my first teachers were my students, like they were just so open with me and wanted to learn about Canada and my country and my family. So there was this beautiful exchange that took place, and um, hearing about what growing up in a democracy was like, and having those kind of same aspirations and hopes for their country, and to see them really taking ownership of what they wanted their country's future to look like um, was incredible. So it was also just very humbling to be able to kind of hear their experiences. And yeah, I'm still so grateful to them. I still go back to the school I used to teach at, and I just feel very fortunate to continue to be able to work in the space for sure.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And with everything going on at the moment, I think it's really highlighted that like local initiatives and NGOs and stuff are so important, and like rely on people volunteering their time and stuff. So
Yeah. And it's such a win-win, like you're gaining this amazing set of context that's from the ground that you don't have to read in a textbook. And that's just much more approachable as well, like you're getting a very human response to serious challenges that are happening on the ground. And a lot of times in university, we're left with like, well, what do we do? What can we do? And there's this sort of like white man's burdened, white savior kind of complex attached to that. And I think you have to be very careful in this work where there is a line. And I think it's important that you just keep learning and never assume that you know any solutions. You're there to kind of support the local organizations and what they see as possible. So it's fascinating. It completely flipped everything I had learned in school.
yeah, I suppose it's life, isn't it? They always say like, trust
Yeah.
the process, don't map everything out too much. um,
Exactly.
that's really cool. And I suppose the most current thing right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, what have you sort of witnessed from actually being there and the work that you're engaged in with respect to like human rights?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a crazy year. Thailand and Burma both went into lockdown around the same time. Thailand was under lockdown first. I think by the end of March, we were in a full-on lockdown. Burma didn't actually have cases till a bit later than a lot of the other Asian countries. So their lockdown wasn't initiated till a few weeks after most of the other countries. But in terms of human rights, it really kind of the pandemic really exacerbated already a very vulnerable situation for people living in the refugee camps along the Thai-Burma border, um, and also inside the country where conflict is very active in several of the ethnic states. So civilians were forced to not only deal with being caught in the conflict zones and that having an impact on their day-to-day life, but also now having to um, survive amid this pandemic that was also threatening their livelihood. Um, I would say there were three main impacts that we've seen communities experience, and that first off would be economic loss and just really struggling to make ends meet. Lockdown measures have meant that they can't leave, they can't go to their farms, they can't go to the markets. So this specifically impacts rural civilians who are not only living quite far away from urban areas, but also in many cases don't always have a reliable internet connection. So they're at a disadvantage with accessing information and um, valuable resources that could keep them safe. And then the second impact would be their overall health and well-being. We've seen this, even in developed countries where people are at home all the time, and we've seen depression rates increase. And this is no exception in rural communities who are very communal people, very community-based people who are now having trust issues in their own community because no one wants to get sick, and with gaps in information. Um, we've all seen this year how fast fake news can kind of travel. So um, that's been a big challenge as well. And then the third challenge is security. Like I was saying before, for rural civilians who are living in already very sensitive areas amid conflict, the Burma army in many states has already increased their troops, and they've used the pandemic to justify that. They've tried to, exert themselves as these kind of protectors of the state, and it hasn't, in many cases, been legitimate. The Burma army is known for arbitrarily arresting civilians, detaining them without evidence, and they've used the pandemic to advance those efforts even more so. So civilians are scared. There's not a lot of clarity on what the government is going to do long term to make sure their safety is prioritized. And even though there's been calls all the way up from the UN in Burma to have a nationwide inclusive ceasefire, that hasn't happened. So with these armed groups continuing to fight with information gaps, also in Rakhine and Chin states in Burma, in several townships, there's still an internet blackout. So that also does two things. A, it limits information, and B, for women, it puts them on a whole other level of risk and danger when it comes to reporting sexual violence or domestic abuse. So it's been very challenging inside, and I would say in the refugee camps, ensuring that civilians who are living in refugee camps where it's very difficult to socially distance, to make sure that their needs are still prioritized, to make sure that they still have basic cooking items, that they have justice referral pathways available to them if they are living in a household where a family member is abusive. So again, these issues all existed before the pandemic, but the difference is the accessibility. And local responders have done an excellent job, but they're really being pushed to their limits in terms of resources, to make sure that their communities that they're a part of to make sure their needs are met. So it's been very challenging.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose, have the government said anything? Have they issued any sort of statement or, intention of support for these more vulnerable people in the society?
Sure, it's a good question. We we did see Burma respond once they had a substantial amount of cases in the country. There was a lot of sort of, I wouldn't say denials, but there was a lot of apprehension that COVID would even reach Burma. Um, and I think that did some damage early on because civilians didn't take it seriously. And then, when it did, cases started to rise. Um, there's just some preventable measures that could have been taken well in advance, having seen other countries start to kind of handle it. Um, so they issued a COVID economic relief plan, which was meant to distribute cash transfers to civilians across the country and also to support people who had lost their jobs. On paper, this was a good initiative, and it was something that a lot of countries did, was issue this economic relief plan to support their countries and their populations who are out of work. Unfortunately, this didn't go far enough. There were quite a few civil society organizations who wrote reports after the funding was distributed, and ultimately said that there were rural populations that were too far beyond the government's reach, that were still in desperate need of these cash transfers that couldn't get them.
Mm-hmm.
So while it was a good initiative, it definitely could have been more successful had the National League for Democracy government and the military worked closer with local civil society groups who, again, are on the ground and have direct communication. Another thing that would have been more beneficial was Burma is a very diverse country with over 135 ethnic languages. So ensuring that information is not just made available in Burmese, but also these various ethnic languages, and through different forms as well. There are people in Burma who cannot read and write, so having visual aids available to them on how to respond was another gap that a lot of community-based organizations had to fill. The Burma government also formed 2 emergency task forces, one with civilians and one with the military. But again, other challenges there, largely rooting from trust. Civilians, although they had a lot of hope when the NLD took power in 2015, there's been, they just won their re-election campaign, but I wouldn't say the trust in them is as high as it was 2015. So that relationship on its own just needs a lot of rebuilding and work for communities, especially right now, to be able to trust their government during this time. So to answer your question, the government did respond, but in many cases like these, it's often too late. And then you have community-based organizations, NGOs, filling the gaps that the government either didn't identify or wasn't prepared to address.
Okay. I suppose it's good then that these organizations were around and have been around for a long time so that they could, reach those other people. I suppose it's kind of just, it's a bit of hindsight, which is a bit unfair, but I suppose it's just highlighted, like this whole mistrust and the pandemic. Now everybody's fearful. Do you think that's something that the government will work on to sort of rebuild the rapport with its people, or do you think they're going to just carry on as it were before?
So community-based organizations and NGOs have, they've tried to work with the government before. And the advantage that local groups bring is that they have that expertise on the ground from either lived experiences as displaced community members or refugees, or survivors of their own human rights violations. So I think the government would do really well to listen to the lived experiences of people who are not benefiting from the government's response as a way to to see the gaps that are there and the challenges, but also work together in a more collaborative way to close those gaps. And at the end of the day, leave the government no excuse. I mean, the concerns are coming right to you. Then there's an opportunity there to work closer together. Um, I don't know how seriously the government will take that offer. Up until this point, from what I've seen, is that there's, again, just a lot of trust building that needs to take place first. Um, the NLD, since their victory, has approached ethnic political parties to start working together more collaboratively, and this is a good step. But again, it's too early to tell how meaningful that effort is until there's a meeting and negotiations. Um, so the civil society space in Burma is incredible to work in because it's so active, and there's a lot of really dynamic, intelligent, very vocal voices on the ground who are identifying these gaps and putting them in reports and statements and addressing the media and doing infographics and digital media, just showing data in very interesting ways. So the resources are there, and groups are collectively continuing to lobby the government to pay attention to these recommendations. So I'm sure those efforts will continue, and it's with optimism that I hope the government takes those concerns seriously. But it's hard to tell really at what point they will, if at all.
Yeah, something that we just have to hope for and wait to be seen. Like,
For sure.
Yeah, the activism, I suppose, the pressure on them to do something.
Yeah.
So something that we highlighted at Human Rights Pulse was the 16 Days of Activism campaign. I'm not sure if you saw that. So I suppose, did you notice, any particular thing in relation to that was highlighted in Burma or by other organizations, anything like that?
I love this question because I think this campaign it's such a big deal in Burma. And like, to be honest, in Canada, I didn't know about it. And then when I started getting involved in the women's rights space here, it kind of blew my mind. I mean, the advocacy around this campaign specifically is very well coordinated. Um, Speaking to this year, the organization that I work for along the border, they're active in the 9 refugee camps and inside Karen State in Burma. So they adopted a theme this year of legal accountability for everyone. And by that, they meant that no matter who you are responsible to report any type of violence that you see. Doesn't matter your position. And in addition to that, that victim, the survivor, is entitled to legal representation to have the perpetrator face consequences. So within the 9 camps and in the 7 districts in Karen State, there were activities every day with the whole community. And this is, at a time of COVID where it was definitely compromised. There were restrictions on crowd sizes and mask wearing, temperature checks, everything. But it was still, an effort that was successful in the fact that there was awareness raising activities through role playing and writing competitions and debates and dialogue. And the reason it's so important is that a lot of the feedback we got was from women who were very surprised to hear that they had rights. And that just kind of reinforces the need to keep educating, keep trying to close the gaps. In addition to that, not just informing women that they have rights, but how to access them, what justice referral pathways are available to them, what kind of support local groups can offer in terms of legal fees, advising, safe houses, this kind of thing. So it's a great campaign. And of course, like, the end of year message is always that this isn't just something that should be acknowledged for 2.5 weeks out of the year, but something that is a constant issue every year. And violence in general in Burma is kind of a taboo subject, and it's one of those issues that you constantly kind of hear is a private issue and should be dealt with at home and not brought into a public space. So that's one challenge that CBOs are having to dismantle and really work towards undoing these kind of patriarchal systems that allow that kind of thinking to continue. So there's a lot of time and effort put into educating young people so that at a young age, they're learning and understanding how to report why violence is unacceptable, and how they can play a role. This is men, women, children, everyone in the community can play a role in stopping violence, and that this isn't just a women's issue, but it's a community issue and one that makes everyone safer. So every year I'm so amazed by the effort and the coordination that goes into not just with local women's organizations but human rights organizations, bigger organizations. It's a really incredible kind of campaign to witness on a larger scale. It's just really important that the recommendations and the visibility that's given is reinforced throughout the year, because 16 days is not, arguably it's not enough. You need more time to push these issues for sure, or for change.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I think what you said about how there were so many different varieties of activities and, infographics or workshops or whatever, I suppose that's really crucial for Burma. Like you said, like not many, there's a lot of people who can't read or write or stuff like that. So I think, you kind of have to assess the sort of community that you have within your country and what you can use or what methods you can deploy to engage everybody.
Definitely. And I think it's so important that the organization I work with was aware of that and really worked to ensure that the activities were inclusive for everyone. Um, yeah, it's a great campaign, and I love the visibility it gets every year. So yeah, so many interesting things happened this year for sure with the campaign.
Oh, cool. And do you know if any specific recommendations were made to the government from the 16 Days of Activism campaign in Burma specifically?
So it's interesting because the 16-day campaign ends on Human Rights Day, which is December 10th. So there's kind of like collective recommendations that come into that. Basically, what women's organizations in Burma have been calling for is, specifically in Burma, the 2008 Constitution really protects the military from being held accountable for any crime that they commit. If a soldier from the Burma army rapes a woman, very rarely will he be tried in a civilian court. It will take place in a military court where everyone involved is handpicked by the military. So very often the survivor does not see justice. So a longstanding recommendation from women's groups and human rights groups has been reforms to that constitution, because it doesn't do survivors justice. The whole constitution as well is just filled with very sexist language that discriminates very openly against women. So a complete restructuring, if not just removing that constitution completely, has been a longstanding call. Also, just for violence to be taken more seriously, Burma has had a bill that has been drafted in 2016, the Prevention of Violence Against Women law, but it has just stalled in Parliament, and this is a big frustration for women because while the bill is not perfect, it's the first bill of its kind that really acknowledges violence to various degrees. Again, it's not perfect. It's not in line with international standards and definitions of what constitutes rape and other abuses, but it's a start, and taking that bill seriously would be one thing at least that the government could do to show its commitment to protecting women and survivors of violence against women.
And how you said that they've sort of stalled it. Have they given a reason for that, or is it just
There's there's a lot of different stakeholders who are involved in drafting the bill, and from my understanding, there's delays on things like how to define rape and what that constitutes. And there's men and women who are involved in this drafting process. Um, so that's one of the reasons for the delay. I think a lot of it largely being quite bureaucratic and pushing other issues. There was just the election in November and now the pandemic. Like I feel like they're just kind of using it to kind of be like, oh, but later we have to kind of do these things first. But on the flip side of that, a lot of justice for women happens on the ground. There's not a lot of faith in Burma's rule of law to begin with. It's not a justice system that is known for being fair. So a lot of local justice happens more on the ground through village track leaders or religious figures in the community. And while this is one way of doing this, at the end of the day, justice should not take place with bribes or large amounts of money. And that is the risk of it being done at a local level. The doing it on, through Burma's courts may legitimize it more, but at the same time, it also, it runs the risk of the survivor facing even more trauma just because of the bureaucracy behind the system.
That sounds really, really challenging, especially with the law you said with the military, how they can pretty much get away with it. It's just not very just.
Yeah, they don't like to be challenged on it. I mean, there was an attempt earlier this year to repeal several parts of the Constitution, and it just didn't go well. The military, was very reluctant, very defensive. They maintain that they are the protector of the state and that the Constitution legitimizes everything that they do in the interest of the state. But human rights groups have been calling for a redraft for a very long time just because it's extremely sexist and really just protects their interests, not really the countries or civilians.
Yes, it's so hard to comprehend if something's that oblivious in terms of, sexism and whatever.
I was reading up on it, and apparently Burma and Uganda both are like the only two countries in the world that have that the military has such control in the governance and the constitution, which is again like one of the reasons why like this work is just so interesting. Is the obstacles are quite significant, but the commitment to challenging systems and status quo is very persistent, very what's the word? Oh my gosh, I'm blanking. It's I mean, they're just not exhausted by the effort. There's so much momentum behind what's being done. So it's very cool. You're always learning new skills, new tools on the best way to challenge these systems and bring attention to abuses and serious issues happening.
Cool. And hopefully with this video or article, whatever it ends up being, we can sort of shed some light on international political pressure. Bring about some change.
For sure.
And I suppose going forward, going into the new year, are there any particular issues that we should keep our eyes on for Burma, or is it more like the same issues but worse?
Yeah, I mean, 2021 is going to be interesting. I think people will be paying attention to how the National League for Democracy in their second term, how they govern, what they change. If they take the first 5 years as if they take any of those lessons into consideration and some of the criticisms that they received internationally and locally, what they do with that. Right now, one of the most alarming human rights issues is the very quickly deteriorating space for freedom of expression. And journalists and activists, young people who have challenged the government either on Facebook or through protests, have been arrested at alarming numbers. And these laws that are used to kind of silence and suppress activists have been used an extreme amount. And it's worrying for the state of press freedom and for the safety of human rights defenders who are relentless in their pursuits for justice and accountability and transparency. So I think that that would be one thing to watch. There's been some really good reports that came out in 2020 from freedom of expression organizations who are actively following how many activists are facing charges related to freedom of expression. So it would be very interesting to see how the NLD responds to some of this mounting pressure to reform laws or to just stop punishing activists for exercising their right to express themselves freely in very nonviolent ways. So I have my eye on that for sure going into the new year. And also, of course, with the pandemic, I mean, the response in Burma has been far from perfect and things aren't getting any better. The cases are not going down in Burma. So I think it's important to watch how that continues to have an impact on people, but also, again, what continues to just humble me is the response by community-based organizations who in the new year will have data, I know they will, and documentation that will likely start taking the form of reports and analysis that donors in the international community can use to help us lobby for more funding to continue the work we're doing on the ground. So those are the three things. It's going to be a big, I think 2020 was like the preview. I think 2021 is.
Thought it was going to get better in the new year.
I mean, I think we've learned a lot. So I think now it's like, okay, what do we do with those lessons? And how do we approach the challenges that we've become familiar with in just really thoughtful ways that are, that, show that we have learned something. And I really hope the government and some of these bigger stakeholders with more resources, I hope that they've been paying attention and that they use 2021 to give support where it's needed, to trust the responders on the ground, and to just make that space safer and flexible, and not increase the Army's presence or forget about rural people who are really struggling to get by right now. So I'm a cautious optimist. I really hope that they've learned or can at least take some lessons moving forward. But I am confident that local people working on the ground, these organizations they'll continue to do what they do for sure in the best way possible.
For sure. And then, sorry, one thing with the rural communities, how it's hard to reach them. Do you think that's from lack of funding, or do you think what is that down to? How do we make that more accessible for them?
I think in rural areas, depending on where they are, they're less likely to speak Burmese. So that's where, again, local organizations who speak, most of the time will speak the state's ethnic language, will be able to get resources and personal protective equipment to them. And also just like there's more trust from like a local organization to a local community. So local leaders, they know how to get to the villages. They know if the road is bad, who to call to come arrange a pickup to deliver services and materials. And I think reaching them in a more improved way would be the government to work closely with those groups. If they have the resources and the materials to distribute, to me, it makes sense that they work with local organizations on the ground to ensure the delivery, because that's what they've been doing for years. Even before COVID, they were distributing, hygiene kits and food and relief from the conflict zones, blankets during the cold season, medicine, all these things that they have expertise in coordinating. So I think the coordination efforts and trust building with the government is a really important first step that needs to be made um, to ensure everyone in the country, you know, not just those in urban areas, but that migrant workers, that women, that those living in the conflict zones. I mean, ceasefire needs to happen, and the government needs to be aware that everyone needs this support right now. If everyone's going to be, you know, to have the best possible response.
No, that's great. I mean, it's been really eye-opening to, you know, pick your brain, as it were, and get your insight from actually being there. And yeah, I mean, I didn't know there were all these all these issues. So I think, if anything, thank you for, you know, explaining that to me, and hopefully it will shine some light for some of our other audiences. And
Yeah,
really, you know,
and
2020.
it's a very, like, there's so many good reports that are done. I really encourage people um, to look up some of the local organizations who are working on the ground in Burma. And like after the call, I'm happy to provide like a list state by state or of issues because it's fascinating. There is just such good work being done. I still have so much to learn. And I'm just really grateful. I really appreciate being able to talk about some of these issues. And yeah, I think conversations like this can be really helpful to getting, you know, the message about what's challenging right now and how groups are trying to respond in the best way possible. But yeah, that there always will be work to be done. It's just, you know, figuring out the best way to respond. So thank you so much for the opportunity to do this. This is really interesting.